Wait, is he the reason you've started actually eating lunch? That is the question Fiona Kerr asked, standing in the doorway of a trauma bay at Toronto General, taking in the scene before her with the calm assessment of someone who had spent 20 years reading rooms. Cecily was in the bed, monitors running, IV line in, still wearing the navy gown she had worn to the Helix Foundation gala 3 hours earlier. And sitting in the chair beside her, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, was Isaiah Mensah. Still in his bow tie, still in the seat he had apparently not left since he brought her in. Cecily's fingers were wrapped around his cuff. Fiona had received 14 phone calls in the past 4 months in which some version of the sentence, "Isaiah handled it really well," appeared. Sometimes it was the way he had reorganized the equipment manifests for the northern shipments. Sometimes it was how he had stayed late to walk a new volunteer through the intake process. Once, memorably, it was simply that he had noticed she hadn't eaten before a board presentation and left a container of leftover pasta from the staff room on her desk with a post-it note that said, "Eat this before you go in or you'll regret it," which was direct to the point of being rude, and she had laughed about it for 3 days. Fiona had listened to all 14 calls. She had been listening carefully for the past 2 months. She stood in the doorway and she laughed. Cecily looked at her with what authority a woman in a hospital gown could project. "Do your job. Your BP is stabilizing, which I can see from here. I am doing my job." Isaiah said nothing. He looked at the far wall with the studied neutrality of someone determined not to contribute to the current line of inquiry. If you want to understand how Isaiah Mensah ended up in that chair, you have to go back about 4 months, which is when he started at the Helix Medical Foundation as a logistics and operations coordinator. Not a senior role, not the kind of position that appeared on anyone's shortlist when they were recruiting someone with his background. He had spent 11 years in community health systems management for a hospital network in northern Ontario, coordinating supply chains, overseeing equipment procurement for 14 facilities across a stretch of the province, where the nearest highway sometimes meant 2 hours on a logging road. He was good at it in the way that people who grew up watching systems fail learn to be good at keeping them running, by knowing exactly where the cracks were before anyone else noticed. He left because of Felix. Felix was 10. He had his mother's way of going completely still when he was thinking hard and his father's stubborn habit of refusing to ask for help until the last possible moment. When Abigail died, a fast-moving infection that the doctors in Sudbury called rare and that Isaiah would spend the following months learning every clinical detail of, Felix stopped talking for almost 3 weeks. Not selectively. He just stopped. He would look at Isaiah across the dinner table with this expression of such concentrated attention, as if he was conducting a continuous quiet audit. "Still here, still here, still here." Isaiah stopped traveling for work. He stopped taking calls after 8. He went to every science fair, every basketball game, every school presentation about provincial ecosystems. He turned down a director position in Ottawa because it required relocation, and Felix had finally made 2 real friends in their neighborhood in Scarborough, and Isaiah was not going to take that from him. The Helix Foundation position was in Toronto. 40 minutes on the GO train, predictable hours. He applied without expectation and was hired within 2 weeks. He later found out that 3 people before him had left within their probationary period because Cecily Vance was, depending on who you asked, either extraordinarily demanding or simply someone who did not tolerate a half-done job and found it genuinely difficult to understand why other people did. Isaiah did not find it difficult to understand, he just didn't share the habit. Cecily Vance had built the Helix Foundation's Northern Supply Program from 43 partner communities to over 90 in 6 years. She ran it with the particular precision of someone who had watched her predecessor drain 1/3 of the endowment through mismanagement and understood, at a cellular level, what it cost when people in charge stopped paying attention. She was 44. She had been described in 3 separate magazine profiles as formidable, which was the word journalists used when they meant something closer to frightening but couldn't print it. She had noticed Isaiah the way she noticed most things, not all at once but through accumulation. She noticed that when she gave him a task, he came back with the result, not a status report. She noticed that he had quietly restructured the intake log for the northern shipments in a way that flagged 3 recurring discrepancies that no one had caught in 8 months. She noticed that when Felix called, and he always answered if it wasn't in the middle of something critical, his voice shifted. The efficiency drained out of it. He became slower, more careful with words. the kind of present that professional environments usually squeezed out of people entirely. She had overheard it 4 times and pretended not to each time. She told herself this was professional assessment. He was unusually capable. It was reasonable to track capability. She told Fiona something slightly different. It started the way these things usually do, sideways. She'd mentioned something from the day Fiona would ask a question, and somehow the answer kept circling back to Isaiah. The way he had handled a difficult vendor without making it into a scene. The way he had left the pasta. The way, at last month's board meeting, he had caught her eye from across the room when the chair was making an argument she disagreed with, and the look on his face said he had already spotted the flaw and was waiting to see how she would handle it. Fiona had listened to approximately 12 of these calls before she said anything, and what she said was, "Cecily, you've mentioned him in 7 separate conversations this week." I was giving context. "You described how his voice changes when he talks to his son, twice." Cecily had changed the subject. Fiona had let her, but not without noticing. The Helix Foundation annual gala was held at the Fairmont Royal York on a Thursday evening in late October. 300 guests, a string quartet. A program Cecily had spent 6 weeks refining, centered on a new partnership initiative to provide subsidized diagnostic equipment to First Nations health centers and remote communities across northern Ontario and Nunavut. The kind of initiative that the current board chair, Garrison Price, had been quietly trying to table for the past year, always with a different procedural justification, always with the same result. She was backstage reviewing her notes when Garrison appeared beside her with a glass of water. "Isaiah asked me to bring this over," he said. "Said you hadn't eaten since noon." It was exactly the kind of thing Isaiah would say. That was the detail Cecily would return to later, when she had the distance to think clearly, that Garrison had watched Isaiah closely enough and long enough to know precisely which name would make her accept something without question. He had studied the habit and borrowed it. She drank the water. 11 minutes later, she walked on stage. The tightness came first. She told herself it was adrenaline. She had given this presentation in her head 40 times. It wasn't nerves. The podium felt further away than she had measured it. The room acquired a slight wobble at the edges, like a photograph slightly out of focus. She heard the microphone stand tip before she felt herself reaching for it. Then there was a voice, low and completely steady. "Cecily, look at me." Isaiah was already on the stage. She didn't know how. She learned later he had been watching from the moment she walked out because she had been pale since before the sound check, and he had been tracking it. He checked her pulse, checked her breathing, opened her bag for the EpiPen she always carried. He stopped. The device was expired. Not recently. It had expired 14 months ago. He used the kit from the venue's medical station instead. Her breathing began to stabilize, but she needed a hospital, and the ambulance dispatcher said 40 minutes. A multi-vehicle collision had shut down both southbound lanes of the Gardiner Expressway. 40 minutes was not an option. He carried her out himself. She was semi-conscious for most of the drive. She knew it was Isaiah because of his voice. He kept talking, low and steady, saying her name the way people say the name of something they are not willing to lose. At some point, she found the sleeve of his jacket. She held on to it. She was still holding it when Fiona came through the door. Isaiah had found something while Cecily was being assessed. He had gone to retrieve her bag and account for the expired device. He was the kind of person who documented things even in a crisis, 11 years of supply chain management as muscle memory. When he looked more carefully at the expired EpiPen, he noticed the lot number on the casing. He knew that number, or rather, he knew it wasn't in the Helix Foundation procurement records. He had audited those records 2 months ago, when a supplier transition had flagged some irregularities. This device had not come from their system. Someone had switched it. He went to Fiona before he left the hospital. He spoke in 3 sentences, what he had found, what he suspected, and what he was asking her to do. Fiona studied him. "That requires patient authorization." "I know. 2 minutes." He went back in. He told Cecily what he had found, what it meant, and what signing the sample extension would require. She was exhausted and still slightly unfocused from the medication, but her hand was steady when she signed. Fiona had a contact at an independent toxicology lab, one she used in cases where she expected standard results to be challenged. Before he left, Cecily looked at him for a moment. There was something she wanted to say, and she couldn't quite locate it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He picked up his jacket. She'd let go of the sleeve at some point without noticing and walked to the door. Then he stopped. His job ended at the lobby of this building. The sensible thing, the safe thing for both of them, was to go home to Felix and let the rest sort itself out. He turned around. "I need access to the Foundation's logistics records for the past 18 months, he said. "Not tonight. But before you agree to anything anyone asks you to sign in the next 72 hours, I need you to know what I think we're looking at." Cecily held his gaze for a long moment. "All right," she said. Outside the bay, Fiona watched through the window and said nothing. She had known Cecily Vance for 15 years. She had watched her build walls around herself that would have impressed a structural engineer. She watched Isaiah Mensah stand in the doorway of a hospital room at 11:30 on a Thursday night, refusing to leave before he knew she was safe. She capped her pen and made a note in the chart and decided she had been right from the moment she walked in. The records told a story that took Cecily 20 minutes to read and considerably longer to accept. The lot numbers Isaiah had flagged corresponded to a batch of medical devices, portable diagnostic monitors, pulse oximeters, cardiac alert units, that had been quietly removed from the Foundation's active inventory 10 months ago. No recall notice, no defect documentation. They had simply been taken off the books, the records adjusted to make the numbers balance without explaining where the units had gone. "They sold them," Cecily said. "That's what I think," Isaiah said. She closed the folder and thought about the initiative she had announced the previous night. Subsidized equipment to remote communities, First Nations health centers in places where the nearest hospital was an air ambulance away, where staff couldn't afford to question the provenance of a donated cardiac monitor, where a failing device in a treatment room might not fail in a way anyone could trace. She thought about Garrison, who had been trying to table that initiative for a year. She thought about the glass of water and the name he had borrowed. The warehouse access request cleared 2 days later. They went in on a Wednesday evening using Cecily's credentials and a legitimate audit justification Isaiah had drafted that morning. The facility was in Mississauga, climate-controlled, meticulously organized. 2 meticulously. Isaiah cross-referenced 3 lot numbers against the deleted records and they matched. The devices were there, repackaged and relabeled, staged for distribution. 7 shipments, 14 months, 21 communities across northern Ontario and Nunavut, most of them without the legal infrastructure to trace a failing device back to its source. They were out of the building in under 5 minutes when Isaiah's phone picked up an after-hours motion sensor alert. The account belonged to Garrison Price. Isaiah transferred what he could to a portable drive. He also noticed, on the way out, 2 interior cameras mounted above the storage shelving that he had not seen on the way in. Garrison would have the footage within the hour. The drive went into the inside pocket of his jacket. 1 copy, physical, no network trace, the right call for security. It nearly ended everything. 3 days before the emergency board vote, the storage unit he had been renting in Scarborough caught fire in the early hours of the morning. He drove there knowing the interior was likely gone. He went in anyway over the fire crew's objection because he understood enough about fire behavior to know the locked metal box in the back left corner had a chance. It did. He got the drive. He also got second-degree burns across his right forearm and smoke inhalation severe enough that the paramedics would not release him without transport. By 9 the next morning, Garrison had issued a statement suggesting Isaiah had started the fire himself to manufacture evidence. By noon, the board had voted to suspend Cecily's executive authority pending a full review. By 2 in the afternoon, a detective arrived at the hospital. At 4, Garrison came to see Cecily at her office. He was measured and quiet. He told her that if she continued, he had the relationships in provincial family court to ensure that a custody evaluation for Helix Mensah would reflect the judgment of a man who had repeatedly placed a minor child in proximity to criminal proceedings. He said this clearly. He said he wanted her to understand the timeline. After he left, Cecily sat alone for a long time. She thought about Isaiah in a hospital bed for the 2nd time in 2 weeks. She thought about Felix, who had apparently spent his birthday money on a kit to build a portable health monitoring prototype because he wanted to understand what his father's old job had actually involved. She thought about a signed authorization form for a blood sample. Her signature, her decision, made the night she was still half sedated and more clear-headed than she had been in years, sitting in a secured refrigerated unit at Toronto General, waiting. She picked up her phone. She called Fiona. The compound Fiona's independent lab had identified was a synthetic anaphylaxis accelerant, a chemical agent designed to amplify the body's immune response to an existing allergen, triggering full anaphylaxis in someone who would otherwise experience only a mild reaction. Its documented use was almost entirely industrial. Specifically, it was used in the calibration process for a line of medical monitoring devices that, according to the records Isaiah had pulled from the Mississauga warehouse, operated under a manufacturing authorization held by a private holdings company registered to Garrison Price. It was never just the equipment, Fiona said. It was never just the equipment. Cecily drove to the hospital herself that evening. Isaiah was awake, sitting up, his right forearm bandaged to the elbow, his phone on the tray beside him. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Garrison's people have been watching me for 6 months," she said. "It hasn't slowed me down." She pulled the chair to the side of the bed and sat down. "The drive, is it readable?" "I haven't tested it, it's in the bag." He nodded toward the windowsill. She reached for the bag herself. The casing was warped, but the internal memory had survived. She had a reader in her bag. She needed 40 minutes. "Cecily," he said it quietly. "Before we go any further," he threatened Felix. I know what he said. That's not something I can treat as acceptable. Neither can I. She looked at him direct, which is why we're not going to give him time to file anything. She held his gaze. You chose to stay. Every time you had a reason to leave, you chose to stay. I am not going to respond to that by walking away from you. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached for the bag himself and handed it to her. The drive was 61% recoverable. The distribution logs were intact. The shipping manifests were intact. The repackaging records were partially corrupted but legible enough to establish the pattern. What was missing were the earliest entries, the ones that tied the first falsified procurement records directly to the first outbound shipments. The ones that would set the full timeline clearly enough to be uncontestable. She spread the recovered files across the kitchen table in Isaiah's apartment late that evening. Felix was across from her, ostensibly doing homework on his laptop. Ostensibly. "Mrs. Vance," Felix said without looking up. "Felix. There's a folder on here that isn't mine." She looked up. He turned the screen toward her. She recognized the file string immediately, the naming convention of an automated transfer, the kind generated when source metadata was absent. Isaiah appeared in the kitchen doorway. Felix looked at him. "Dad, did you use my laptop for something?" Isaiah was very still for a moment. "The evening 3 weeks ago when I picked you up from Amir's. I needed to move a file before a meeting and used yours because it was in the bag." He looked at Cecily. "I forgot to delete it." She opened the file. It was the missing section of the distribution log, the earliest shipments, the entries that established the complete timeline, intact, uncorrupted, sitting on a 10-year-old's homework laptop because his father had been running late 3 weeks ago and hadn't cleaned up after himself. Cecily sat back in her chair. She thought about what people discard when they believe they are untouchable. She thought about the communities in those shipment logs. She thought about a nurse in a health center, north of Thunder Bay recording vitals on a monitor that had been repackaged in a Mississauga warehouse by a man who would never know her name. "Felix," she said. "Yeah. Don't close that file." The press briefing was held in the lobby event space of the Helix Foundation's building on a Friday morning, booked legitimately through the public-facing calendar 2 days prior. Cecily arrived at 8:45 with Fiona beside her, a lawyer she had retained 3 days earlier, and a communications consultant who had worked on 2 provincial health inquiries. Fiona presented the toxicology findings at 9:30. The compound, its industrial source, its documented connection to Garrison's manufacturing authorization, the chain of custody, the independent lab report, the original hospital records. She stated facts and answered questions. The lawyer presented the distribution records at 10 o'clock, manifests, repackaging logs, shipping documentation for 7 illegal shipments. He named the communities, he named the lot numbers, he named the dates. By 10:20, 2 representatives from affected First Nations health authorities had confirmed on record that the lot numbers matched devices currently in use in their facilities. Garrison came downstairs at 10:35. He stood at the back of the room and looked at the cameras, the reporters, and Cecily, standing to one side, watching him with an expression that carried no anger in it, only clarity. "You're dismantling everything this foundation was built on," he said. "I'm dismantling what you built inside it," she said. "There's a difference." He was escorted from the parking structure by two officers from the RCMP's Commercial Crimes Unit, who had been briefed by Cecily's lawyer the previous afternoon once the evidentiary chain was complete. The board voted to reinstate her executive authority by noon. She accepted reinstatement with 3 conditions, presented in writing: full recall of all defective equipment in the field, financial restitution to every affected community, and the establishment of an independent supply chain audit office reporting directly to the full board, bypassing executive authority entirely. All 3 conditions were accepted before 3 o'clock. Isaiah's name was cleared within 48 hours. The custody threat dissolved without requiring a legal response. It had never been anything more than the last instrument a man reaches for when everything else has already failed. He did not return to his logistics coordinator position. Cecily had offered it. He had declined. "It's not about what happened," he said. They were in her office, the late November light coming through the windows at an angle that made the city outside look quieter than it was. "It's about what I can actually do from the audit division. I know how these supply chains work. I know how to read a procurement trail. I can do more from that position than from the desk outside your office. You can also do it without reporting to me." "Yes," he said, "that too." She was quiet for a moment. "That's practical." "It is." She nodded. He turned toward the door. "Isaiah." He stopped. "The night in the car," she said. "When I told you I'd never trusted anyone that automatically, and then I didn't finish." He was very still. "I was going to say that you're the first person in a long time who made me feel like being known was safe." She kept her eyes on the desk for a moment, then looked at him directly. "I've spent 15 years managing every variable, and this was the one thing I couldn't manage and couldn't schedule and couldn't argue myself out of, and I don't have a clean precedent for it." He was quiet long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer. "I think," he said carefully, "you do what you do with every other situation you don't have a model for." She waited. "You stay with it," he said, "and you see what it becomes." Felix's school science fair was on a Saturday in December. Cecily arrived without a prepared remark, without an agenda, carrying a coffee from the shop on Bloor Street and wearing flat boots and a wool coat that had nothing to do with her job title. She found Felix's table in the second row without needing directions. The project was a working prototype of a low-cost portable health monitor, a small circuit board visible beneath a clear casing, a handwritten display card beside it explaining the function, the estimated materials cost, and the communities it was designed to serve. At the bottom of the card, in careful block letters, Felix had written, "For the health centers that don't have enough. Designed with my dad and Ms. Vance." Cecily stood in front of it for a long moment. "The hardest part was the sensor calibration," Felix said, appearing at her elbow. "Dad said you'd want to know that first." He was right. "We used a reference point from one of his old hospital manuals." Felix looked at the model with the satisfied attention of someone who had solved a real problem. "He has a lot of manuals." "I know." Felix glanced sideways at her. "Are you still calling him after hours to ask about things you already know?" Cecily looked at him. "He calls you back," Felix said, entirely unconcerned. "He does the same thing. He just waits a bit so it doesn't seem obvious." A small shrug. "It's kind of obvious." That evening, Isaiah took her to a restaurant on a side street in Kensington Market. 12 tables, a menu on a chalkboard, no reservation required. The kind of place where the noise was warm rather than competitive. "No board members," he said when they sat down. Noticed. No agenda. Also noticed. She looked at him across the small table. "Is this a date?" He held her gaze. "Only if you're not planning to introduce me as your audit director." She reached across the table and took his hand. Not the way she had held his sleeve in the trauma bay, that had been reflex, survival, the body reaching for something solid before the mind could object. This was a choice, completely deliberate, entirely hers. "Then, let me introduce you," she said, "as the first person I ever trusted without deciding to." He looked at her hand in his. He looked at her face. He didn't say anything for a long moment because some things don't require a response so much as they require a person to stay still and let them be true. Outside, Kensington in December was cold and ordinary. A streetcar passed on College Street. Someone was selling chestnuts 2 doors down. Inside, a woman who had spent 44 years deciding that certainty was the only safe place to live had reached across a small table and taken the hand of a man who had carried her through a crowd, sat beside her in a hospital room, and chosen, Every single time he had a reason not to stay. That is the part of this story worth holding on to. Not the board vote, not the arrest, not the press briefing in the lobby. The smaller truth underneath all of it. That sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is stop managing what they feel and simply let it be what it is. If this one stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Every week there's another story about the people who showed up when it mattered, and the ones who finally let them.